Welcome to the Fresh Expressions Podcast, Season 6. I'm your host, Heather Jalad. I'm a pastor and cultivator of Fresh Expressions, new faith communities that strive to reach new people in unexpected places. In Season 6, we're diving into discipleship, exploring what it means to follow Jesus and share Jesus in our everyday lives, and how churches can cultivate a culture of discipleship that is more than curriculum within their communities. Along the way, we'll be talking with church leaders and practitioners in the Fresh Expressions movement about the crisis of discipleship the church is navigating. We hope you will love this episode. And if you've benefited from this podcast, can you help us spread the word? Leave a review on Apple Podcasts or just share your favorite episode with a friend or colleague or on social media. Now, let's start the conversation. A church is only as good as its disciples. So says Neil Cole, author and pastor. Well, that'll get your attention, won't it? In this pre-season episode of the Fresh Expressions podcast, Matt Lake shares about the wicked discipleship problem. This is audio from a previous webinar that Matt led around this very complex, multi-layered problem. Matt is the lead pastor of First Church Williamsport, a trainer and mission strategist on the Fresh Expressions team, and author of Crossing the Discipleship Chasm, which I commend to you as a wonderful resource in the discipleship conversation. Discipleship is indeed the focus of Season 6, and so we thought this would be a great pre-season episode to begin that conversation. There are a number of things that are addressed in this presentation, some of which I think will scratch an itch that you may have had for some time, and some which are very thought-provoking and I think will really lead you to be even further engaged in the conversations that we will have along the way in this season. I would love to hear what questions you're asking, or maybe what itches are being scratched in the conversations along the way. Discipleship is often approached as information, curriculum, classes. And Matt makes the argument that discipleship needs to be approached as apprenticeship, mentorship, and have a communal quality to it. I know in my experience, discipleship is often perceived as information, and Matt talks about this, versus formation and transformation. He makes the point that authentic discipleship takes time because at the core of it is relationship. It's a journey. It's not often neat and tidy, and yet I think we try to make it like that. And then he also talks about the role of gifts and passions in the discipleship journey and how significant those things are. It's more than taking an inventory or a test, but what do we do with those once those are taken? And what does it look like to apply those gifts and talents rather than necessarily trying to fit them into a box? So I hope you'll enjoy the audio from this webinar, and I hope that you'll listen in on this season of the Fresh Expressions podcast.
I want to be really clear about what we mean by wicked, because this is different than it used to be a few years ago. So wicked problems are by their very nature multifactorial. They contain many layers of issues which must be addressed, but all of those issues are happening at once. So they're not in sequence with one another. It's everything converging at the same time. And because of that, there is no easy solution. There's no magic bullet to suddenly make it all better. And I would propose that just as the problems are multi-layered, so the responses for potential solutions also have to be multi-layered. And the reason I think this applies specifically to discipleship is this. which isn't so different from life in the church as a whole. And that is what we used to be able to do to foster what we thought was good discipleship was pretty easy. Just offer the right program, offer one more Bible study, give one more sermon towards it in that direction. You do those things, and sort of almost magically, everything is better. And one of the things that I've discovered in ministry is that we can do all of those things and more, and yet something doesn't seem to take root in the way that it once did. People don't seem to be growing in discipleship the way they once did. So, what are we supposed to do about that, and how do we address that? As we start to think about that, I love the way my friend J.R. Briggs says it. Just to be really clear, he says, men and women, we don't have a leadership problem in the church. We don't have a money problem in the church. We don't have a participation problem in the church. We have a discipleship problem in the church. And one of the reasons that I love that is that even though when we face challenges in our church, while there's no one thing that would make everything better, in my humble opinion, if we get discipleship right, there's a really, really high likelihood we'll get just about everything else right. And so for that reason, I am incredibly passionate about discipleship, and I'm incredibly excited to dive deeper into discipleship and explore what that can look like. Because if we get this right, a whole lot of other things start to change for us. And then Neil Cole says it even more bluntly. He says, ultimately, each church will be evaluated by only one thing, its disciples. And then he says, your church is only as good as its disciples. It does not matter how good your praise, preaching, programs, or property are. If your disciples are passive or needy or consumeristic, not moving in the direction of radical obedience, he just says your church is not good. So not a whole lot of mincing of words there from Neil, but I think that's right. And I think that when we don't get our discipleship right, we're off course on so many other things. So somebody was already asking, well, how do we define a disciple or discipleship? What do we even mean by that? So again, just to give us a place to jump from, I'm going to propose this. And we do this in my setting and others I've worked with, try to be really clear. What's our definition of discipleship? For today, we're going to say a disciple is one who follows Jesus, so currently following, and is being changed by Jesus. That is, in being transformed, growing in Christ, growing more into likelihood and likeliness of Christ, and committed to the mission of Jesus. So especially if you look in Matthew 4 and 28, you'll see reasons why we lift this up as our definition. But in that committed to the mission of Jesus, part of what that means is more disciples. If we're doing our discipleship right, there should be other disciples being raised up. So think of Jesus, the idea of fishers of men type of thing. Uh, we can know that discipleship is happening if we're seeing that in others. At the same time, there's a high likelihood discipleship is not very healthy if we're not seeing other disciples be made. And just
Matt,
yeah, go
but
ahead, Len, go for it.
before you jump on, could you go back one and give us some clarification a little bit more on that previous slide? You had the idea of following. I know
Yeah,
you talk about John Mark Comer a little bit in the book, and this idea of kind of apprenticeship or kind of following along. And in fact, one of the questions that's already come up in the Q&A is that a challenge is that people are interested in being quote unquote Christians, but not often interested in apprenticeship with
yeah.
Jesus. So talk about this idea of discipleship as apprenticeship.
Yeah. So, and again, I mean, I think hopefully as we walk through this, some of these things will start to make more sense. But I think one of the things that has happened in our current time and culture is that discipleship has gotten so individualized, meaning if I do my own individual devotions, private time, Bible study, one of the pieces that we've lost is a more communal element that involves things like mentorship. And so part of what we want to be figuring out here is exactly to that point. How do we walk with others in such a way that they're growing in discipleship, but also how are we growing in discipleship because somebody else is mentoring us? So we are
Right.
absolutely, for me, for us, that is part of what it means to follow Jesus. Like we're not saying this is an optional part. That's a direct part of it. I even love the image that you can almost picture in scripture, the disciples literally physically following behind Jesus. There's that active pursuit of him as rabbi. Um, what does that look like for us today? So yeah, great question, Len. I appreciate that. Keeping that in mind, then you can see here I just want to highlight what happens then when discipleship isn't happening. Well, we know this, so I won't spend much time on it, but across every age category, there's an increase in nuns. So that is those without any religious affiliation, those with no faith connection. And again, there's no exception to the age categories. Every single one is experiencing decline. Why is that? Well, part of it is we are not living in discipleship. We're not raising up other disciples. And so if that's not happening, we can't be fully living into discipleship. And therefore, it's a significant problem. Or we could say it this way. Todd Wilson says that 80% of churches are either in decline or plateaued. And that's a high number. In fact, that's a conservative estimate right there. But again, if the vast majority of our churches are not healthy, they're plateaued or declining, they're not bringing in or raising up new disciples, how healthy can we be? So again, we know those things, but to me, that highlights the significance of the discipleship problem that we have. So keeping that really in mind and kind of laying that out for us, just to share quickly in my setting and kind of for me, like, why do we move in this direction and really start to explore discipleship and the wicked problem of it? The catalyst for me was a number of years ago now. I was trying to create in the setting that I'm in Williamsport, Pennsylvania, the most robust discipleship program we had ever done. Like I knew enough to know that we were struggling with discipleship. So my answer to our discipleship dilemma was create a really robust program. So I did a lot of work on this. Like I got some books together, I got some articles together. I did all of these things, and the content was really good. We met for a number of weeks in a row. We had robust conversation. I shared all of this profound stuff. And I got to say, I was feeling pretty good about myself and what I had presented. And on the very last night of this program that we had done, that I had developed, that I felt so good about, one of our individuals walked out that night, and he was not kidding. He looked at me and he said, "Is this all there is?" And in my head, I was like, what do you mean, is this all there is? Like, I just poured out like all this great information and content. I didn't even understand at first what he meant. And what I came to realize was this. He felt like what we had spent our time doing was really fostering and creating what it meant to be a good volunteer in the church, but not a disciple on mission for Jesus. And so that kind of rocked my world. I mean, again, and I didn't know what to do. I was like, what are we going to do? How are we going to try to address this? If I'm making my best effort here and I fall this short, like that's a big problem. And so that was really this sort of major question and kind of moment of crisis, out of which we began to explore more carefully, what does it mean to engage in authentic discipleship? And part of what we began to realize is this, that we can't navigate the problem of discipleship if we can't name the elements that are contributing to the problem that we have. And so I just want us to be really clear for ourselves, because I think these are things we're all going through. And the reason this is a wicked discipleship problem is all of these things are happening at once. And so as I go through this, I just want to invite you to be thinking which of these really apply in your setting. And some of you have already started to mention these things in the comments, but we're in a time of cultural upheaval. So what worked yesterday does not work today. We can't just offer another Bible study and think, hey, this is going to fix all our problems. We've got irrelevant measures. We're not even sure how to measure healthy discipleship anymore. The best guess a lot of times we have is how many people showed up to a particular program. That's fine, but is that really a measure of discipleship? Increasingly, there's a focus on information over what I would call formation. So we tend to think if we give just enough content, out will come disciples. We know that's not always the case anymore. Maybe it never was. There's a sense of institutional preservation that we do want to focus on our kingdom, our church, over God's kingdom. And usually what that means is I'd rather have a volunteer serving somehow in the church because we need another warm body, rather than somebody, again, being set on mission in the world in following Christ. There tends to be a passive Christian spirituality. So we increasingly have a desire to be comforted over what we might call contending for the faith. We also have a culture of instant gratification. I saw somebody mention the issue of time, which is so right. Authentic discipleship takes time. And so in a world where it seems like there's no margin, either for us as leaders and servants or people in the world with their busy schedules, how do we get past that? And then recognizing that discipleship, it's just not focused on a whole lot. I mean, let's just name it. Sometimes, many times, discipleship is not the most sexy topic. It's oftentimes more engaging to talk about become a captivating speaker and preacher or leadership or those things. But we don't talk a whole lot about discipleship. And so I'm curious, in that what might resonate for you. And with that, let me just summarize it this way. I think there's really three layers of the problem that we can identify, again, all happening at once when it comes to discipleship. Number one, there tends to be a focus on quick information over patient formation. So we want the instant over the time it's going to take. And we all recognize we live in that culture of instant gratification. A second layer would be this, an orientation to functioning in the institutional church, making that the highest ideal. Even if we don't mean to do it, we tend to focus on a volunteer culture over discipleship culture. That's where some of those irrelevant metrics come in and that idea of institutional preservation. And then a third layer would be this. We do very often have what I would call a passive Christian spirituality. We want to be taken care of and comforted more than being set free to serve in some form of radical discipleship. And then you've got those three layers, and then you bring on something like a pandemic, and oh my goodness, like it's just a mess, right? Like, how in the world do you do discipleship in the midst of all of that? So let me just ask you here real quick, if you could do me a favor, in your setting, as you think about those three areas, these three layers against the backdrop of the culture that we're in, tell me in your setting, do you think the biggest issue that you're facing is that focus on quick information over patient formation? Do you think it's the focus on volunteer over discipleship mindset, number two? Or do you think it's number three, that a lot of my people, or maybe myself included, it's the struggle for comfort over being set free in discipleship? Just do me a favor, just type in literally one, two, or three. I'd love to see what you see there. So I see three, two, and I know we're going to be all over the board, and I know that there's a mix of these, but I just wanted to see what rises to the top. I
Looks
am,
like, Matt, we've got a couple who wrote comfort over contending, which is number three. So
yeah,
yeah, it looks like there's a clear lean towards three early on, but now we got several twos coming in, a
great.
couple of ones in there. But yeah, I haven't counted them, but it does look like at glance that three seems to be the top one. And I wanted to comment too about that because I noticed in the early Q&A and a couple of comments in the chat as well that people have been using the word commit or commitment a lot,
Yep.
which is fascinating. It feels, and I'd love to get your thoughts about this. It feels like the more clearly you define, and has this happened at First Church or in other churches you work with, the more clearly you define what a discipleship is, then people have an option to either opt in or opt out, honestly, right? In terms of saying they're committed to it or not.
Absolutely. That is part of it, Len, is being able to name with clarity. But here's the other thing, and again, we'll get to this in a little bit. I'm absolutely convinced, and I'll share some of this why in a little bit. I'm absolutely convinced that we know that God has given us all different gifts and abilities to use. I think what we do so often when it comes to discipleship in the church is that when we're looking for a volunteer to fill a slot, people don't really want to be committed to that because it's not maybe who they are, or it doesn't
Mm,
interest. But when we do the harder work of getting to know people and know their gifts and abilities and then challenge them into discipleship based on their unique identity, now there's a willingness to there's commitment for two reasons. One, you're affirming who they are. Like, you're affirming who God made them to be, and we encourage them to live into their giftedness, and through that living into discipleship in the way that God has made them. That's a distinct difference where we're trying to set them free to be who God's created them to be as disciples versus we have X amount of slots that need filled. Will you fill them? So yeah, and again, we'll touch more on that, but right, this idea of commitment, obviously quite difficult, a big deal. So great. Thank you for some of that initial feedback, everyone. That's super helpful. And again, I think we all have a combination of these factors, but seeing two and especially three rise up is interesting. So here's what we know. The answer to discipleship is not just these things. It's not just one more class or program, not just a bunch of rules or regulations, not a moral checklist. It's not a feel-good group. It's not even a better or more robust Bible study. And I'm in no way saying Bible study is bad. We need that. I'm just saying that's not the complete answer. I would also say it's not found in isolation. Like, there has to be an element of community in our discipleship. We see Jesus modeling that a lot. And then it's also not going to be fixed either with a few sermons or just one more life group or small group. And we can't just say to somebody in our church, hey, you cover the area of discipleship and expect everything to be better. It doesn't work that way. Discipleship is part of the DNA of everything that we do. So if discipleship is not these things, and we're facing all of these layers at once, like, what do we do and how do we respond? And here's what I want to propose to you. A number of years ago, it's called the Carl Dunker problem, and it's based on cognitive psychology. I just want to literally read you the conundrum that they debated over and tried to figure out an answer to, and then tie it into our discipleship conversation here. Here's the problem they defined. They said, suppose you're a doctor faced with a patient who has a malignant tumor in his stomach. It's impossible to operate on the patient, but unless the tumor is destroyed, the patient will die. There's a kind of ray that can be used to destroy the tumor. If the rays reach the tumor all at once at a sufficiently high intensity, the tumor will be destroyed. Unfortunately, at this intensity, the healthy tissue that the rays pass through on the way to the tumor will also be destroyed. At lower intensities, the rays are harmless to healthy tissue, but they will not affect the tumor either. So what's the type of procedure that might be used to destroy the tumor with the rays and at the same time avoid destroying the healthy tissue? When I've read that a while back, it really just got my mind thinking around this idea of the discipleship problem. And the reality is we are facing all these layers of problem. How do we get at that? Is there just one, if there's not just one thing we can do, what can we do? And what I began to really think about and ponder on was the idea of convergence. Like, what would it look like for multiple factors to come together at the same time to actually address the wicked problem that we're facing? And one of the things I'm convinced of is this, that multi-layered problems need multi-layered solutions. And I think we see some clues from history. So let me just give you a couple frameworks to think about, and we're going to pull these all together. First of all, if any of you are familiar with the work of Alan Hirsch, he talks about this concept of APEST based on Ephesians chapter 4, verses 11 to 13. And in that, he talks about apostles, prophets, evangelists, shepherds, and teachers. So prophets are those pioneers who go out in exploring ways. Prophets are truth tellers. Evangelists are those who have a gift to share the good news in a contagious way. Shepherds offer a nurturing pastoral presence, and teachers share knowledge of the faith. Here's what I would suggest. We know that when those five elements are together, God's church grows. We could say that discipleship is happening in healthy ways. If we look back through history, here's something that I think has happened. In the early church, when the church was just beginning, I think the dominant office was apostles. You can literally think of the apostles of Jesus. And what did those apostles do? They had to figure out how to share the faith in a world and culture that did not know the faith. And they succeeded wildly in doing that to a large degree. The church early on, despite persecution and despite hardships, it grew a tremendous amount. Then around, and there's different dates you can pick, but around 381 AD to 451 AD, something interesting happened. And that was Christianity went from being persecuted to being protected in the Roman Empire because of Constantine and others who came along, and suddenly it was a protected element. What this meant was that now people could give deep attention to the faith. This was a time where creeds, such as the Nicene Creed and Apostles' Creed, could be developed, and you could go deep in the faith in that way. It didn't last real long because as Rome eventually fell, you entered into a time of the Dark Ages. And during this time, I really think it was the shepherds and all these little individual places and communities spread all across in this dark age, as it were. They continued to nurture the faith in small individual communities. And that was for a long time. It's for over 1,000 years. But then around 1500 came the Reformation. And so people like Martin Luther rise up, and now it's the voice of the prophets that are coming along and offering truth once again, and reform begins to happen. And then that takes us up into the more modern age from roughly 1700 to all the way to the 20th century, where people like John Wesley came along and Whitefield and others, and who just had a gift to share the faith in a contagious way, and movements occurred. I share all of that with you because I think we live in a day and an age where all five are needed almost in simultaneous fashion. For this reason, it's not uncommon at all now in our churches that we can be talking to somebody who's sitting there and maybe an older gentleman who's been in the church for 70 years, and they know almost all the nuances of the faith, and they want the deepest, meatiest sermon that there can be. And maybe sitting behind that individual is maybe it's the boyfriend of a young lady in the church who this is the very first time they've ever stepped foot in a church, and it's certainly the first time they've ever heard about faith. And somehow we're supposed to reach both of those individuals. How do we do that? I think this is what's happened in the church. I think we need to reclaim both the formative element of who we are in discipleship, our teachers, our shepherds, and prophets, our truth tellers, but at the same time, reclaim what it means to be generative. That is, having ascending impulse among apostles, evangelists, and prophets. Now, here's what I want to invite you to think about for just a moment. In your setting right now, I'd be curious to know, and if you could type in the chat for me one more time, if you look at this particular screen, there's no right or wrong on this. I'm literally just looking for your setting. Tell me, which office do you think you have the most of in your church? apostles, prophets, shepherds, teachers, or evangelists. Just do a quick search in your head. What do you think you tend to have a lot of? And just do me a favor, just write one of those 5 words in the chat here real quick. Which one is the top one that you see? So already seeing a lot. Yes, great.
As
Already
those
seeing
coming
shepherd.
over, Matt, we got a lot of those coming over. That's very helpful, you all. I noticed one of the questions plays exactly into what you were just describing, Matt. And you might answer this later or maybe now, depending on how you feel about it. But Rob Schellenberg wrote, it's difficult to determine what to provide for in terms of content materials for people at different stages of their faith journey. How do you determine where people are and how to help them grow in their faith journey?
Great question. And the answer, which we're going to look at in a little bit, is before we do, the first thing I think we have to do with people is understand where they are so we then know where to go from. And I think what we do a lot of times in our churches, we choose the one model for all approach and try to give that to everyone, regardless of where they are. I think that's a little bit backwards. I think what we need to do is find out where they are and then walk forward with them from that point on. And again, I'll try to share a little bit how we're trying to do that. Thank you for the comments here. I'm seeing and this is not surprising because it's in my setting too. I'm seeing a ton of shepherds and teachers. Here's why I bring this up, and thank you all for responding. If our discipleship is only based on shepherds and teachers, there's a whole lot of nurture and a whole lot of consuming, which we need. But if we only focus on that and we never get to going out and sharing the good news of Christ, then there results what I would call a spiritual obesity. And to be very clear, if our church, some of our churches are really good at going out and being sent in apostolic ways and sharing the faith. But if that's all we ever do is go out and never take time to go deep, that's also not good. And so part of what we need to do is understand for ourselves as individuals, which way do I lean? And then affirm that. So let's say I'm a shepherd. Great. Let's affirm that and give thanks to that. What I then realize is that my growing edge is probably going to be based on sharing or going out in some way. If I'm an apostle and I go, awesome. But then my growing edge is probably going to be learning how to go deeper in faith through knowledge and being nurtured. And this is where we'll lay it out in a little bit. This is where these tensions start to come in, that when we identify where we are, it simultaneously affirms where we are, but then shows us our growing edge to move forward in discipleship. If most of our churches are good at shepherding and teaching, we say, thank you, God, for that. But now we need to embrace the tension of what it means to be sent and go out, and then vice versa. And this is where the tensions start to become helpful for us. Real quick, we get a few more examples in history here. Remember the early church in Acts. They had shepherding and teaching elements. So they had a thing called the catechesis. They learned how to share apologetics. There was a focus on truth in Christ. Eventually, they developed creeds. There was the didache, which allowed them to study, and there was a 3-year process to be baptized. I mean, think about that. 3 years of formation before we even said you can be baptized. But at the same time, the early church learned to go out into new spaces and places. There was mentorship. There was sharing the good news in new ways. They did healings, and there were powerful experiences, and there was a prayer focus, and there was an unleashing. That was awesome. The church had both, and through that healthy discipleship, a movement of the Spirit, a movement of the church occurred. One other example, there haven't been a ton in recent times, but it's a truth that there was a significant Wesleyan movement a little while back. At the height of it, 1 in 4 in the United States were actually Methodists at one time. Interestingly, they also had a strong formational element. So teachings on doctrinal resources such as the Articles of Religion, Confessions of Faith, General Rules, Wesley sermons, large gatherings of worship, a focus on orthodoxy and right belief. That was a strong focus. But at the exact same time, Wesley himself said, the world is my parish. And so at minefields and in life groups and classes and serving the poor and broken, and they even introduced something called circuit riders. The movement was growing so fast, they literally said, hey, circuit rider, go to this place first, and then the next place, and the next place, and the next place to do a sermon and touch base with people, but then keep on going. It wasn't just right belief, it was action as well. They were people on the go. And so when we look at these examples, we can start to see that discipleship is healthiest when both sets of elements are present. And so what I want to invite us to think about is how do we begin to reclaim that tension? And so again, multi-layered problem. Now we have a multi-layered approach, and that is we're going to focus on our shepherding and teaching for sure, but we're also focusing on our apostolic, prophetic, and evangelistic side, and vice versa. But then with all of this, how do we find something that has enough structure but can also be flexible? How can we be intentional and organic at the same time? How do we offer formal? Because that's needed. But man, we need informality as well. How do we offer something that is formative in who we are, helps us go deeper, but also generative and sends us out so that other people can experience new life? How do we embrace right belief? Because we need it. How do we also embrace right practice? Because we need that. And almost everyone that I talk to, we tend to fall on one of these two sides, and it's not right or wrong. It's just where we are. If you're a doer, that's awesome. But your challenge then is going to be to go deeper. If you love going deep, your challenge is going to be to go out. And so, how do we meet people where they are and help challenge them forward? And what I want to suggest to us today is that, and we'll talk about this much more in the master class that's going to come up here on October 3rd, but how do we embrace then the tensions that I've just named? I love the image of a bridge for this reason. We often think of tension as a negative thing. It is not negative. In fact, it's beautiful. Here's why. Think of a bridge. If the bridge has no tension at all, it just hangs in the gully and goes nowhere. If the bridge has too much tension, it snaps and it breaks. If you have the right amount of tension, what do you find? A way created where there wasn't a way before. So in this time where we're facing this wicked problem of discipleship, I really believe that if we can embrace tensions we're talking about, that we can find a way forward in discipleship that wasn't there before, even in the face of the wicked problem of discipleship. So I won't do this with you now. I would just invite you to think about this. Spend a little time for yourself and or your church. And as you go through each set of these tensions, just mark, where are you? It's not a right or wrong. It just gives you a place to begin, because remember, we can't navigate what we can't name. And so it just helps us to say, oh, we're really good as a shepherding church. We're lousy as an apostolic church, or vice versa. Spend a little time doing that and just see where you are. And then here's what I would suggest to us. Usually the answer for discipleship that I find for most people and most of our churches is that we take something and we just want to apply it from the top down. So maybe our denomination or whatever we're widely connected with gives us something. We bring that to the church. Our church leaders adopt it. They ask everybody in the church to start doing it, and hoping that as we do enough of that, disciples will come out of it. That can have some okay effects, but I actually think this is backwards, especially when we look at the model of Christ himself. With Christ, we know that the multiplying movement of discipleship, it began from the bottom and worked its way up. As individuals were changed and challenged in their discipleship, they grew into leaders. As they then continued to live into healthy discipleship, those leaders helped establish churches. As those churches lived into healthy discipleship, a movement then occurred. And so what we're trying to do with this approach that we're talking about is really getting back to a more organic level in the model of Christ himself to see how people can be unleashed in discipleship. So how do you do that? And again, we're going to talk more about this at the masterclass, but just to start to give you an outline, what we've basically developed in our setting, and I want to encourage you to think about, is how do you find a healthy rhythm that is sustainable and doable at the same time? And there's a way to do that, which we'll talk about. But it basically involves this, that once people are connected in your life of your church, spend some time helping them identify and observe what are their gifts, what are their passions, who did God create them to be, what are their top, abilities. I know a number of churches that do spiritual gifts of different kinds, and I think that's a piece of it. But I think it's so much more than that. What are they passionate about? What has God wired them to do? How do we help them discover what part of their calling might be? Once we've identified that for a person and discover where they are, then we can start to filter those things through those tensions that I just raised for you. And I'll explain how we do that here in a little bit. And then once people have a sense of filtering them through the tensions, it gives them a clue about where they need to go and what action they need to take that will result in deeper discipleship. Part of the beauty of this is, again, you see people where they are. So you're meeting them. It doesn't matter if they've been in the church for 50 years or this is the first time they've ever stepped foot. You're meeting them where they are and growing from that point. So thinking about that, like, here's how we set up our year in my setting. All of you, or a lot of you probably have, is there a place for people even to connect? And let me just first of all say, if you don't have this is a great place to start. Is there any way for people in the life of your church or newcomers to connect, either in discipleship or membership? Create those spaces. So for us, when people join in the life of the church, that's a step of connection. Once they've done that, we invite them to what we call our disciples journey step 2. That's where we do a lot of this discovering, identifying who they are, where they are in their discipleship, identifying their call. Then we do a time of the year where anybody who's done a step 2 and they've discovered part of their call, we help them embrace that by working through the tensions that I've raised for you here today. And then we seek to set them free. And this is a yearly rhythm that we live into. So it's not all the time, but it's on a continual, constant time. And I'll give you the dynamics of that, but just to kind of lay it out linearly, it looks like this. We have 3 or 4 times a year where people can join in the life of our church and connect. We take the fall of every year and help anyone who's interested discover who God's made them to be. We take the spring of every year and we take that calling and we help them think through these tensions that I've been raising with you so that then after that, we can set them free to live into discipleship. So let me give you an example of what I'm talking about. Here's how the tension can help us move forward in discipleship. If we take the example of APEST, you can think of somebody who might be maybe heavy on individual learning, so they're good at going deep. The challenge, and I've mentioned this a little bit, but the challenge then becomes how do they take that depth and start to share it with others and go wide? Conversely, somebody who's really good at being on the go all the time, how do we help them slow down and go a little bit deeper? And then asking relevant questions around their discipleship with that. So let me give you a couple quick examples, and then we'll pause here soon to get some more responses from you. In our setting, I'll give you, first of all, kind of an institutional example. In our setting, we've had a youth ministry for a long time. And I would say to you that it had tended to fall pretty heavily on the shepherding and teaching side. They gathered every Sunday night on our premises for 2 hours for programmatic learning, fun, and teaching. And that is wonderful. One of the things that we learned as we went through this discipleship tension journey that I'm describing for you is we started to ask the question, all right, we're going deep with our students in this way. What would it look like to infuse more of a scent, more of an apostolic infusion of DNA into our youth ministry? What might that look like? What could emerge? One of the things that has emerged for us is something we call Faith Zone. Now, once a month, we're able to meet in our local middle school setting, and we're able to have lunch with the students who are there. And they get anywhere from 90 to 120 students every time that they do this, where we just get to make a connection with those students on their turf at their time. Once that connection is made there on their turf, it opens up an invitation to invite them into our more programmatic time on Sunday night. It changed when we looked at the tension and said, we're doing great on the shepherding and teaching. What would need to happen or change to be sent? That's one example with our youth ministry. Here's another example. You see Charlene here on the screen. Charlene's #1 gifting is shepherding. She has a deep heart to nurture people deeper in faith. She loves to care for people. So what we discovered with Charlene is that she had a deep passion for a nursing home. As we learned that with her and her shepherding gifting, we affirmed that, but then we raised the challenge, Charlene, in your discipleship as a shepherd, what does it mean for you to be sent? And what emerged, eventually, she decided to go into a nursing home to take care of any individuals there that she could, but she actually started a worship service for those individuals in the nursing home to share with them. And last Easter, actually shared a sermon with them on Easter Sunday. Now, remember, she's a shepherd, which we affirmed, but she was challenged in her discipleship to be sent, and that's what emerged. Last example I'll give you is that we've also had the opposite happen. We've had some things where we're seeing people sent out that we want to go deeper. We have a weekly dinner meal midweek for our community. Anybody who wants to come, they share in the meal. That's a sent activity, which is great. One of the things we've learned to do over time, though, is we've actually started to share in some prayer time there, some pastoral care there, and even some brief teaching there. And now for people that gather in that space, they understand that as their church. It's not just a dinner to come and eat. It actually has become a worship experience for them. Now, it only began as a dinner. We've infused some of the teaching and shepherding side into it, and now worship has emerged. So again, I could give you a whole list of examples. I won't do that right now, of people that have been raised up in different ways, new ways that we have found to be really exciting. Some things we were hoping and praying for, some things we never saw coming. But what we've tried to do is embrace whatever God is leading them into in their discipleship. So here's what's different then for us, and then we're going to pause. Thinking about this wicked discipleship problem, a couple things that's different than other things we've experienced from other places. There is a focus on relationship. It lets people be seen where they are. There's a sustainable congregational rhythm. We do this every year, but it's not every single week for 5 hours that we're doing this. We have found a rhythm that works in our setting. It's allowing for intentionality. We focus on some of the same things each time, but it's very open-handed. There's not a rigidity to it. Every time we do another cycle of it, it builds momentum. Notice that it's also affirming people in their gifts, but challenging them at the same time to go deeper or wider, whatever it is they need to do. And also notice, and this is important, this is driven more by the needs of the body of Christ, not by the needs of our specific church. So in other words, what we're not trying to do is say, what quota of volunteers do we need filled? What we're trying to do is to say, how's God wired you, and how do we best walk with you to set you free in discipleship in that way? We think this is a model more like Jesus. It's dynamic in the sense that it continues. It doesn't pause for us. It offers a ground up kind of experience, like I mentioned. It lets us be intentional, but there's lots of entry points for people to come into it. We believe it values informal focus just as much as formal focus. And it offers a whole variety of layers to this wicked response and problem of discipleship. The other thing that it does is it's allowing our church to come into alignment with itself. This is not a set-aside program off in its corner by its own thing. We've helped bring our entire church into this understanding and invite them into it year after year. Now, I will confess to you, we are focused more on quality than quantity. That's important to us. We believe that Jesus did a lot with a few. And so we'll take 3 people fully committed over 30 who are going to stay at the shallow end of the pool. And again, what we're trying to do here is let people live into their calling. We're not trying to fill slots. What we believe is that God will supply our needs as we learn to walk with people in discipleship. And maybe there's some things we were doing, and maybe they're not so important if we can't find volunteers or disciples for them. Then finally, yeah, go ahead, Len.
No, if you got one more, do it. Then I'll jump in. So.
Yeah, one more second. Yeah. So what this does for us, I want to be clear too. Lots of people say, well, can you raise expectations for people? Absolutely. If we lower the bar too much, a low bar yields low expectations. So it lets people be seen in their gifts, and we believe leaves space for God to move. So I just want to invite us today to think about, like, what would it look like? And I love this quote from Alan Hirsch, the irreplaceable and lifelong task of becoming like Jesus by embodying his message. What if everyone in our setting lived into that? Like, what might that look like? And, we may not know the full answer to that, but we know it will be holy and wonderful and significant. So all of that to say, what we're discovering here is that discipleship for us, it's not a class. I mean, there are programmatic elements, but it's so much more. It really is a lifestyle that we are fostering. And so hopefully, if this is at all helpful, I mean, there's probably 100 questions, but I just want to say, like, if you are able to join us then for the October 3rd masterclass, what we will do, we will explore very carefully the 4 tensions that we walk individuals through. We'll share with you how we do that. I want to give you testimonies of those who have gone through Disciples' journey, our experience of this. This is not dependent on church size or budget. It's something that allows your church organically to come into alignment with one another. We want to share some tools about how to navigate these tensions in a key way, how it might apply in your setting. But also, I think this is really important. No matter what level of discipleship you are as an individual or as a congregation, this is an approach that can meet you where you are to help you go deeper and farther. And as we do that, there's a shift then from a volunteer culture to a discipleship culture. And the best thing that I could say for us is that while there are intentional elements to it, it really is an experience to have with one another that we've just seen some really, really great things happening with. So again, I'm sure there's lots of comments and thoughts here, but Len, I'll turn it back to you and we can have some conversation.
Absolutely. You're blowing my mind here, man. I've already read the book. I've been around you for years, and yet I have all these questions. And in fact, I want to say you and I first met when we started our doctoral work together in 2017, and you were beginning to explore some of these questions at that time. And part of our doctoral work, I think, plays into this because we studied a lot this idea of semiotics, so that there's a core image that in often in unspoken ways drives what we do. And I have seen, I've got my Q&A here on my screen, I've got my chat here, and I've been seeing this kind of assumption about a core image that keeps showing up both in comments and in questions. And it's this idea that there's like a linear pathway. And so like someone asked early on, what would a discipleship pathway look like? And someone else was kind of questioning, is this one way? And if I'm hearing you right, and I want to hear you comment about this, it feels like you're saying, no, it's not necessarily like a conveyor belt, right? That we're putting people on, but there's like a different core image here, right?
Yeah, and thanks for raising that up, Lane, because I almost hesitate to even give different images of like the linear four steps, because I think that conveys the wrong idea. The reason that it's not as programmatic as it may look is a couple reasons. Number one, let me just give you an example. Let's say hypothetically somebody comes in and connects with your church, and then they do a disciple, our second step in the fall of a year. It is not uncommon at all for a person to stop there. Like they're not going to grow anymore in discipleship. They're not ready, whatever the reason may be. But we continue to make the invitation year after year. And so maybe not in year two, maybe not in year three, but then suddenly in year four, God is moving in their life. The Spirit is moving in their life in such a way that they're like, you know what? I know I'm now ready to take my next step, a deeper step. And so at that time, they then respond.
Mm.
So that could be after it. The one person could go through all these kinds of things in the year. Another person, it might be 4, 5, 6 years. That's one way that it's not just a program because we never know when that people are going to respond. But here's the second way. This is both fun and scary. If our real goal is to help people grow in discipleship, we actually don't know what the outcome's going to be. And so, people say, I mean, do we really want a fully empowered, encouraged person living into their calling, living into discipleship? Well, yes, when that's meeting our needs. But what if this person is called to live into something that we hadn't started before, or I wasn't really looking for? Or are we going to be prepared in those moments to embrace them in the health of their discipleship? And, you never know. So you never know what you're going to get when you encourage people in this direction.
Someone had asked you to show the wheel again at some point. Do you think, is that too limiting? Is that helpful? Is that also limiting? This idea of a flywheel is an interesting alternative, isn't it?
Yeah, I'll find that here in a second. What I was going to, yeah, and one of the reasons I wanted to show the wheel, like that's my attempt to say this is not so linear. Like it's much more, it's linear in some ways, which let's not set that aside. There's value in that. But this is also circular. Like it's the repetition, it's dynamic. And so we come back to it repeatedly. That's a reality of it as well. I also just happened to see here on the question, someone said, how does this fit with fresh expressions? Well, here's what I would say. It's actually become in many ways the pathway for us to find new pioneers
Mm.
because if you find somebody with a high apostolic calling or a strong evangelistic calling, there's a high likelihood that they're going to be a great person to be a pioneer to help foster fresh expressions. But at the same time, we've also found in fresh expression world, you need supporters. Well, guess what? In this journey that we're describing, you find your shepherds and those people who want to nurture and support. And so then it lets us pair them up with one another. It's really become almost like our farming system, as it were, for not just fresh expressions, but children's ministry leaders and men's mentors and all of those kinds of things.
There's way too many questions than we have time to answer right now, which is fun because we know that there's going to be some great interaction on the webinar, but a lot of response to what you're saying. Diane writes that she sees it as cyclical, repeating over time. So transformation is obviously a result of extended time with people, which you've been emphasizing since from the start. Brian asked a question: can you unpack the seasonal flow of these steps of
Yeah.
the discipleship journey, like fall, winter, spring, summer? Say something about that.
Absolutely. And I mean, this has worked well for us. And this is where for you all, like look at your context. You don't have to do it this way, but what has worked well for us has been we have normally 3 entry points at least each year to connect. So one is right now in the fall, one is usually in January, one's usually in May or so, right before the summer. People can enter into the life of the church and connect. Then what we say to our entire congregation is every fall, we're going to take some time to discover. So we invite everybody, anyone who's never done this, hey, join with us this fall as we discover together God's calling on your life. And what we do with that is we look at the spiritual gifts, we look at their passions, we look at all of those things. And that's usually, just to put some numbers to it, we usually meet 6 times, 2 hours each. So these are 6, and we do it in the evening. That's what works best for our people. It's simultaneously enough, but it's not 12 weeks. It's not every day for 4 months. It's not like that. But we do that in the fall. Then in the spring, we invite people to take their next step. And what we talk about there is embracing their gifts in a way to live into discipleship. And this is really where we dig most into the tensions and really help people filter their giftings through different tensions so that they can discern what their next faithful step might be. And that can be anywhere from 8 to 12 sessions in the spring. And again, about 2 hours each time, but it just depends how many people are part of it. Now, here's what I want to say on this one. This one is one of the most time-intensive pieces. Like if you think eight times or 10 times of 2 hours each, is that intensive? Yes, it is. But I would also say this, and let me also be clear on this. Every time someone takes a step, we're filtering more people out.
Mm.
Like I want to be clear about that. And I want to say we're okay with that because we're convinced again that if we get to spend those hours with people at that third stage of this particular part of the journey, the way we get to pour into them, offer mentorship, be challenged by them, let them be seen. Then when we release them to multiply, it's such a beautiful, wonderful thing to see happen. And here's part of the irony. What you're seeing here on the screen, I used to do all the parts of these. One of the things we discovered for one of our individuals who went through this is she's way more gifted at the connecting piece than I ever was. So guess what? She does it all now. I don't do any of that, and which is a win for me. It actually frees me up with some time, but she does it better than I ever did, which is also wonderful.
You're actually just kind of controversial, Matt. I mean, you're kind of saying it's okay if you filter people out a little bit. I mean, I'm joshing around with you now that this is controversial. I mean, like we see this obviously in scripture, right? The 10 lepers are healed, one comes back, so like what you're talking about here is this idea that the intentional commitment is kind of a self-select thing,
Yeah.
and that quality over quantity is something you're emphasizing.
Absolutely. And I mean, I'll confess that was hard for me at first. Like I've been saying, it kind of gets back to that metrics question. And are we doing meaningful work in discipleship? Well, the only way I could compute that or at least the only way I used to compute that was, do we get X number of warm bodies? And if we don't, we're failing. Well, you need some people for sure, but I've just grown a lot more comfortable that the win is two people even who have moved into discipleship in ways they never did before. And let's get back to our definition. If they're now following in a way that they didn't before, and they're being transformed, and now they're impacting others and their discipleship walk, that's the win. Like that's the beauty. And that's discipleship. Like that's a much more scriptural definition and metric of success than what we artificially come up with.
Okay, we've only got a couple minutes left here. Matt, give us, we got, on the title of the book, How To, right? So you're trying to be very prescriptive here. So if your church, if you're pastoring a church and the church has been just highly programmatic, very topical, very driven by this issue or that issue, I mean, how do you begin to even turn this ship a little bit here so that you begin to focus on this process as opposed to these hot topic issues?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's a whole lot of layers there, right? That in and of itself is a wicked problem. But I mean, I think I would suggest a couple things. Number one, somebody has to be passionate about this. Somebody has to care. Somebody has to say, I want to see this happen. So if you have any voice of leadership in your church, whether you're the pastor or a significant lay leader or whatever, like just somebody, or in this case, those of us who are connecting right now, to say, I choose to own this. I care about this. I believe this is so important. Start there. And then from there, like what can be done in our setting to begin to make this happen? And part of what I hope is that no matter what's going on in your church right now, no matter how busy it is or not busy, no matter how pressed people are or not, uh, look at the rhythms of who you are and where you are, and just what might work for you. Some churches I know, they have found that still Sunday morning, maybe between a service, is their best time. I have found some churches that like want to do like in the morning, some like a Wednesday evening. It's just what works in your rhythm. So
Mm.
part of it then is just observe where you are, and then with that passion, work with the necessary people to just start to put these things, as pieces of them even, in place. The other thing I would say is this, Len, we don't have to do all of this all at once. So let's just say this. If you're a church today, we have no entry point of any kind in our church. Set elements 2, 3, and 4 aside. Just focus for right now on finding entry points for people to connect, period.
That's great. That's great.
If
Uh,
you're, and then each one of those. Yeah, go ahead.
I wanted to mention again the masterclass. You're going to have a chance to dive into this more. There's a coupon that Fresh Expressions is offering. It's Wicked 20. That'll get 20% off the masterclass. It's a $20 class. It's $30 if you include the Verlin Fosner one as well. But I also don't want to end without mentioning the fact that with Invite, you're working on a more of a complete package, what we're going to call a kit, for lack of a better term at this point, that we'll release in the spring that will really give specific tools to people to help them begin to implement these 4 pieces in their church.
Yeah, thanks, Len. That's exactly right. Like I hope today, and again, I do want to emphasize, I'm sure that I've seen lots of questions here, and I'm sorry we can't get all of them. We will address, I think, many of these in the masterclass and walk through with as much specificity as we can. But then, like Len is saying, we do envision being able to put more resources out, because I a lot of times the simple question I get is, tell me how to do this. Well, all right, we'll make it as specific as we can, but we will cover a lot of those in the next session, October 3rd, for the masterclass.
That's right. People need steps. You need steps. Yeah, 1, 2, 3. How do we do this? Chris has to. I'll end with your question, Chris. Does the masterclass cover the 4 steps? He said he's excited about it. Already started talking to the pastor and mentor about it. So this is exciting, Matt. You're actually shaking the tree. Things are happening. This is exciting.
Well, thanks, Len. I appreciate that. And but the reason we're shaking the tree is because the tree shook me. This is not working. What do we need to do here? And I want to be really clear. We are on the journey. Like, we have not arrived at all, but we are encouraged by what's happening. And in the midst of all these barriers and trials to discipleship that have been named, we're seeing we're seeing transformation. We're seeing discipleship occur, and we're excited about that.
It has been so great hanging out with you. The book, Crossing the Discipleship Path or Chasm. I always mess this up. How to turn crowds into people who follow Jesus. It's an honor to work with you, Matt. It's great to hear what you're doing. And the longer we spend, the more excited I get about your work. So thank you so much.
Well, I appreciate that, Len. And this is an exciting journey to be on, and go from there.
All right. Thank you, everyone. You will get an email follow-up. It will have links and more information, and Matt will receive every question that we didn't answer live. He'll have a chance to follow up with those as well. So thank you for your time today, everyone.
Len, just as you say that, yeah, I do want to look through all the questions, and just to say to those on here, I won't promise to get them all answered, but what I will promise is this: I want to read them, and I will address as many of them specifically at the masterclass as possible. So your questions are super helpful, and we'll make our time even better used at the masterclass. So hope we get to see you there.
All right, Matt, close us in prayer.
Would love to. Thanks, everyone. Let's pray. Lord God, thank you for this day. Thanks for the gift of technology that lets us connect from lots of different places. And God, I thank you so much for the heart of all who are gathered here right now. We're here because we care about discipleship. We're here because we care about the health of your church. We're here because we want to follow you ourselves and be transformed in you and see the grace and the beauty of your love offered to as many others as possible. And God, all of that is based on discipleship. So we ask your blessing on this time. I pray, God, that healthy questions are arising in our minds. I pray, God, that there's a stirring in our spirit. And I pray, God, that ultimately you'll use this time to help us individually, us in our churches, and others we've not even connected yet with, grow deeper in discipleship with you. So Lord, we pray all of this today in the power of your Holy Spirit and in the name of Jesus together. Amen.
Fresh Expressions is a worldwide movement of everyday missionaries who want to see churches thrive in the places we live, eat, work, and play by leveraging the creativity and endurance of the inherited church. To learn a simple 5-phase process for starting a new expression of church, go to freshexpressions.com/how to start. Want to learn more from the Fresh Expressions team? Head over to freshexpressions.com/training to learn ways we can work together to provide coaching, training, and inspiration for your church or organization. Jump into our monthly trail marker check-ins, the Pioneer Cohort, or launching this spring for your Fresh Expressions team, the Team Cultivator. You can also get more resources like this on FX Connect, an online community full of other church leaders passionate about reaching new people in new places. Access our entire library of practical and inspiring training materials and connect with other church leaders at fxconnectus.org. Season 6 of the Fresh Expressions podcast is hosted by me, Heather Jalad. It's edited by Joel Limbaum and produced by Jeanette Statz and Kathleen Blackie. Our senior director is Shannon Kaiser. If you've learned something or been encouraged by this podcast, please help us spread the word. You can give us a review on Apple Music or Spotify and share this episode on social media. Now may God bless you in your work for the kingdom.